Great, welcome everybody to the second day of our winter speaker series on prescribed fire and post-fire restoration in Pacific Northwest. Just a little bit about our group. We are the UO chapter of the Society for Ecological Restoration. And so our group's mission is to really provide opportunities and hands-on experience for students at UO to learn about restoration ecology while engaging with local restoration practitioners. We're extremely lucky to be hosting 8 fantastic speakers with a range of experiences in restoration and ecology and traditional indigenous knowledge during this winter speaker series. And today we'll be hearing from Katie MacKendrick and Chris Adlam. And so just, a little bit about the structure for today. We have 20 minutes for each talk, and then we'll save some time at the end for questions for both speakers. So as our speakers are presenting, feel free to either type questions into the chat or write them down and save them for the end. And then we'll have one kind of longer, like 15-minute questions section. So I guess I'll go ahead and introduce our first speaker, Katie. So Katie MacKendrick is an ecologist at the Long Tom Watershed Council. She's been working there since 2012. Working alongside people to improve fish and wildlife habitat in the Long Tom River Basin. She received her bachelor's degree in natural resources at the University of Wisconsin, and then a master's degree in community and regional planning at the University of Oregon. And she has really a wealth of experience in botany and community-based natural resource planning. And we're really excited to hear from her today. So if you're ready to go, Katie, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here with you all. I do have some slides that I could pull up if that's possible.
That would be great. Yeah, you should be able to share screen, but let me know if you run into any troubles with it.
Well, as I figured that out, I will just introduce myself very quickly. Thank you for the lovely introduction. My name is Katie. My ancestors are from Ireland, but I'm many generations removed from Ireland, and my ancestors' cultural practices. I grew up on Ho-Chunk homelands in what is now southern Wisconsin, and have lived and worked as a guest on the homelands of Kalapuya people for more than 10 years. I work for the Long Tom Watershed Council and have for just about 10 years. And I want to talk with you about my work for the Long Tom Watershed Council. But first, I'd like to share with you a little on how I got here. And I know that's, that could, my hope for sharing a little bit on how I got here is because of my audience being students here and wanting to just share, my journey in ending up in this work, because as we know, it's something that I'm infused with passion about, and it's also something that I know very well that in large part is not my story to tell. I'm a guest on Native land. I'm working hard to understand how I can be a good collaborator and an ally with the tribes in this area and the tribal members in my community. So how do I make sense of this? How do I, in myself, understand why I'm motivated to do this work? So just a little bit here. My mom likes to say that my love of plants started when she had sleepless nights and filled them reading horticultural texts. As a wee human, I had the opportunity to start relating with plants, learning how to nurture life that offers gifts in return. My parents grew food and flowers to feed us through the year and to be surrounded by beauty. When I was young, we sold vegetables and fruits and flowers for several years. Throughout school, I really took a great interest in learning how to identify plants by name and acknowledge them by use. And I started helping carry out scientific studies to understand plants' relationships with each other and the land. During and since, I've sought to combine that feeling I came to know early on that nurturing brings gifts with an awareness that people need to work together to realize change and to work toward the world that I want to live in, one that's based on trust, reciprocity, and consent. As an undergrad, I was really moved by a native professor of mine at the University of Wisconsin, Patty Lowe. And as a graduate student at the U of O, I had the opportunity to work with Kathy Lynn, who now runs the Tribal Climate Change Project. I had a chance to work with her on projects with tribal staff and tribal leadership across the Northwest. And I also had a chance to focus my master's thesis research on a project in partnership with the Coquel Indian tribe of the Southern Oregon coast and the Hoopa Valley tribe of now Northern California. And before coming to the Long Tom Watershed Council, I worked for the North Fork John Day Watershed Council in Eastern Oregon, where we had representatives from the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs and the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla on our board guiding our work. So I came to the Long Tom Watershed Council with all of those experiences. I showed up as an ecologist to work on restoring rare oak and prairie habitat and working with a myriad of landowners to do so. Let's see if I can pull up that presentation here, bear with me. And yeah, I encourage all of you, if you have questions, I'm open to you posing them during or after as needed to make this as enriching an experience for you. Oh, well, I recently had to get a new computer so that I could have an internet connection that wouldn't crash all the time, which is making it tricky to share my presentation. But there's some type of firewall locking my presentation, but I wonder if I share it in the chat, if one of you could swoop up the link and I'll give you access to open it and share it. And I'm very much happy to have this presentation shared afterwards in case the slides prove useful to people. So there you go.
Get it up here.
Thank you.
Yeah. So
as I was saying, I work for the Long Tom Watershed Council, which is just a local nonprofit organization. We've been working to improve watershed health and function for more than 20 years. We're an inclusive organization. We're non-regulatory, and we're guided by a board of directors. We're funded by grant money and individual donations. And our mission is to improve water quality and watershed condition in the Long Tom River Basin through education, coordination, consultation, and cooperation among all interests, using the collective wisdom and voluntary action of our community members. Our board, sorry.
Okay, could you send access to the slides?
Yep, totally. Our board and staff have been working hard during the last 4 or 5 years to attend diversity, equity, inclusion trainings to increase our understanding of how we can infuse within the Long Tom Watershed Council scaffolding principles of diversity, equity, inclusion. And in 2019, we put an equity engagement strategy together. We developed a diversity, equity, inclusion statement. That statement reads, the health of the watershed is inextricably linked with the contributions of all people. LTWC recognizes the system's disproportionate impacts of oppression on Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We believe the organization's strength depends on breaking down implicit systemic inequities. We strive to create an inclusive and welcoming environment that grows our collective wisdom. Multitasking to open that presentation. Okay. So how does this relate to burning? How does this relate to fire? Well, it relates by acknowledging our need to decolonize land management practices and social and organizational structures and understand how we can honor Indigenous people. What does that mean? When I say decolonizing, for me, it means giving Indigenous land back, restoring Indigenous land and life. For colonizers like myself, it's about learning how to relate to the land and the people of the land, and acknowledging the truth lies in our intention to connect with each other. We're trying to get it less wrong, and we can practice by relating to each other having multiple minds working together. So yeah, where are we? Look at all those slides. Okay. I'm not sure if you all can see those. I'm guessing so. Yeah, thank you so much for pulling those up. I suppose it couldn't hurt to share the map of the Long Tom Watershed. Yeah.
Is that before?
Yep, this is it. Great, yeah. So here we are, quick view of the Long Tom Watershed. If you're familiar with the area, you can see Eugene there. You can see that blue patch that is Fern Ridge. The Long Tom River starts in the Coast Range Mountains northwest of Veneta, northwest of Eugene, comes south for a while, and then right before Fern Ridge, it has that big curve, turns north and flows north for a long ways until it reaches the Willamette River. So we're a Coast Range tributary to the Willamette River. Long Tom Watershed has a considerable remnant oak and prairie habitat in fairly good to sometimes quite good condition compared to historic conditions in the times colonizers, the Willamette Valley was a majority oak and prairie habitat. And of that habitat, less than 2% of prairie and oak savanna habitat remains, less than 5% of oak woodland remains. As much of as 98%, you could think of in general, more than 90% of the land in the Long Tom Watershed and the Willamette Valley is held in private ownership. So this poses an interesting scenario in understanding how to decolonize land management, where we're a nonprofit working with private landowners who own land that make up the historic territory of Kalapuya people who now have ancestors who are members of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. So we're trying hard to use our relationships with private landowners, with public landowners to work towards decolonizing land management practices. What I've been working hard on to get there is oak restoration, where as a result of fire suppression, Douglas fir trees, shrubs, other woody plants have grown into what otherwise was maintained oak and prairie habitat, very open, lots of grasses and wildflowers, wide growing oaks and lots of space between them. So working hard now to release those trees and encourage the grasses and the wildflowers to grow back so that we can finally reintroduce fire. And as we know, fire has many redeeming qualities, and as I see it, is that opportunity to link us together as people and understand how we can work across cultures to bring the health that our land needs back to it. And that comes in the form of bringing fire back and bringing Native people back to relate with the landscape. We have been working hard based on the relationships with landowners and with partners around oak restoration to start a conversation to understand how we can grow our capacity around relating with fire and around bringing fire back to the land of the Willamette Valley. I'm just gonna swoop through the slides. So yeah, in 2020 and last year, 2021, we had conversations with upwards of 30 people in the Valley to understand how to reduce barriers and gaps to building prescribed fire capacity. Out of those conversations, next slide, we were happy to hear a strong theme emerge, partners raising and affirming the imperative to center tribal needs, voices, priorities, and sovereignty as a new RX or prescribed fire capacity paradigm in the Valley develops. My work and my work with many partners to find solutions to build fire capacity are fundamentally collaborative and are shaped by consistent and ongoing dialogue with regional tribal governments and communities. Next slide. With this foundation last fall, we were able to offer training for 15 indigenous fire practitioners as part of a prescribed burn that we carried out on land south of Eugene. Next couple slides are just a couple pictures of that training experience that lasted for 2 days and resulted in indigenous fire practitioners gaining basic firefighter qualifications so that they could go on to participate in more burns in the region and think about how they might pursue a job in fire or bring that learning back to their community and share it and understand how to relate with fire in their place with their people. The Long Tom Watershed Council supports a Native youth and family internship program the traditional ecological inquiry program. And after the burn that happened as a part of the training, we were able to have families out to plant food in the burn footprint. Next slide. As a result of the work we've done to build relationships, to center indigenous values and prioritize tribal leadership in this work to reintroduce fire to our shared landscape, we're on a path now in collaboration with the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians to organize a regional fire training in 2023 with the intention of increasing capacity. And when I say capacity, it's increasing the ability of people to work with fire on the landscape, having the equipment, having the training they need, and having the ability to fund year-round positions for people to work in this way on the landscape. So we're working hard to increase capacity across multiple tribes and partners. And with hope, the result of this small start we have in place and the big visions we have yet to come, we will be able to relate to our shared landscape here that is adapted to receive fire. We'll be able to work on that together and realize a more healthy land and communities as a result. So that's very fast, but I want to be respectful of the time, and Chris being able to share his work as well. So thank you. I know that was that was quite fast.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was really great. And thanks for working through the technology chaos. Yeah, so we'll have time at the end for questions for both Katie and Chris. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Chris. Chris Adlam is a regional wildland fire specialist at Oregon State University, so just down the road from us at Eugene. He did his PhD at University of California, Davis, which is where I met him, and does some really cool work thinking about cultural burning practices and prescribed burning. And kind of connecting. I feel like he does a great job at being at the intersection of research and practice and communication and making all of those pieces work together instead of having them all be separate. So yeah, for the sake of time, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Chaya. It's an honor to be here and talk to you all. You know, you have a great group, like I was saying earlier, and do great things. And so it's great to have an opportunity like this and to talk after Katie, whose work is also exemplary and very inspiring. So I work with the Extension Fire Program. It's a new program at OSU Extension. My work is in Southern Oregon, Southwest Oregon to be specific. We have other regional specialists who cover other parts of the state. But today, actually, I'm going to be talking about some of the work that I did during my PhD at the University of California, Davis, completed in 2020. And it was work focused on cultural burning, a project I'll talk about called Keepers of the Flame. And what I wanted to focus on today for the purpose of this talk is there's a lot of interest in learning from cultural burning, right? So we see this interest in the media. These are some titles, for example, of articles in the last few years that talk about learning from Native American fire stewardship, what California can learn from native burns. There's also a lot of academic interest. That graph on the top right of number of publications that include the term cultural burning in recent years has obviously gone way up. And a lot of people are grappling with this knowledge of the fire problem and the fact that we need to change the way that we relate to fire. And so naturally people turn non-native people, turn to indigenous people who have lived here since time immemorial and have lived with fire in a totally different way than what we're used to, right? So I think it's a very normal thing to ask, what can we learn as non-native people from the practice of cultural burning? And we see this interest as well in the ecological restoration practice and practitioners of prescribed fire. But really, what does that mean to learn from cultural burning, and what can we learn from cultural burning? So I'm going to be talking about this through the lens of this one project that I did for my PhD called Keepers of the Flame. And this was a collaboration between cultural fire practitioners and researchers and grad students at UC Davis. And we had a class. We took our students out to meet cultural fire practitioners and see their work and talk about their work. And we also organized these workshops that we called indigenous fire workshops after a similar event that happens in Australia annually. And the idea was to bring in community leaders, legislators, regulators, agency people, to hear directly from practitioners of cultural burning about what this practice means to them and some of the obstacles and opportunities that they encounter. The first indigenous fire workshop was at the Tending and Gathering Garden, which is a restoration site. Actually, it used to be a gravel pit that was restored, and part of it was restored specifically with cultural plants for the use of cultural fire practitioners, or cultural practitioners, in the community. So people can gather the deer grass or red bud that they use for basketry and various other food plants. We also went to meet with Don Hankins, who's a Plains Miwok fire practitioner and professor at Chico State University and manager of the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve. And he has extensive knowledge from traveling around the world and talking to people who use cultural burning in all sorts of places about this practice, and it's a very keen way of reading the landscape for how fire works across a landscape, or could work, and uses that knowledge to manage this reserve. So that was very inspiring for all of us. And then our second Indigenous fire workshop was at the Jack Kirk Preserve in Mariposa with Ron Good, who's the chairman of the North Fork Mono tribe, and his family. He's been using fire for 20 years at this place, which is an 8,000-year-old Miwok village site. And people from many tribes come to gather the plants that are kept healthy by this practice, including sourberries, red bud, elderberries, and many other things. You can see the weavers in the photo in the bottom right, using the freshly harvested twigs from some previously burnt materials. So back to this question, what can settlers learn from Indigenous cultural burning? That's a big question. We're not going to answer it in 20 minutes, of course. And this is only the lessons that I'm sharing are just from my experience working with people in these specific communities. So of course, it's not the ultimate answer, but I felt like I wanted to share, at least some of the takeaways from our work together. In order to answer this question, I want to think about two things. One is, what is knowledge? And what are the ethical dimensions of knowledge? So I'm going to start there, actually. If I give you my grandma's Christmas pudding recipe, you can go and use that. You can go and do it, and that's fine. In my culture, in Western culture, knowledge doesn't really come with strings attached. It's just a thing that if you possess it, you can use it, right? Indigenous knowledge obviously has some different dimensions. And of course, we can't generalize across all Indigenous tribes or knowledge systems, but I think that generally knowledge is sort of thought about in a different way. And there are sort of some intellectual property issues, obviously, that come up. And beyond that, the people we worked with were very generous to sharing their knowledge with us, when really they had a lot of other things to do, and they didn't have to by any means share this knowledge with us. Given the history of white settlers and academics taking that knowledge and extracting that knowledge from communities and even suppressing that knowledge, it was obviously not anything that happened lightly, right? They placed this trust in us, and so I feel a sense of responsibility based on that, to now do what I can to make sure that this knowledge continues and that people can use it in their communities the way that they see fit. I think this is an important thing when we start talking about learning from Indigenous people, is that there has to be a sense of responsibility for the knowledge that is given, and not just take it and then go over and start burning and say, oh, great, I learned from Native people, now I'm going to go and burn my own thing. And the other thing that comes in is the sense of reciprocity, right? So we really wanted to center this in our project. The students contributed in various ways to the goals of the cultural fire practitioners we were working with. They helped prepare the site, they helped with manual labor, we helped get permits and do some planning and logistics, and we produced media. The students produced media as their final project that we made available to the people in the community for use in their own educational and outreach projects. So this connects to what Peter Nelson in a recent article calls working with Indigenous people as collaborators, not data, right? So when we engaged with these cultural fire practitioners, the idea was that we were going to be learning together about this practice. We weren't coming in and learning from Native people about their practices and then taking that knowledge. We were coming in and we were talking about how can we co-produce this knowledge and learn together, and then how can we make sure that that knowledge stays in the community and goes back into that community as living knowledge. We don't want it sitting on a shelf somewhere. There's no reason to do research on Indigenous knowledge except to support Indigenous people in using that knowledge. The other thing that I want to think about ethics-wise is, where does prescribed fire actually come from? I'm very interested in promoting the use of prescribed fire in my work. Well, prescribed fire comes from cultural burning. And I know on the one hand, there have been traditional burning practices in Europe, but the practice as we know it today in the West is it comes directly from cultural burning. In the 1910s, there was a big debate among settler managers, forest managers, land managers, and policymakers about the use of fire. And the debate was, should we or shouldn't we adopt the practice of Indian light burning? So it was explicit that this was a type of knowledge that they saw Indians using, Native people using, and they were discussing whether or not they should do that and do prescribed fire based on that knowledge, or whether they should suppress fire. And of course, we know that the decision was made to suppress fires with unfortunate consequences, as we know down the line. But we need to recognize where this knowledge comes from. And when we're promoting prescribed fire, we need to make sure that we're doing what we can to honor where that knowledge comes from and uplift the work of Indigenous fire practitioners and advocates. So back to the first question of what is knowledge? There are several ways of thinking about knowledge. And the thing that comes to mind most of the time for people, I think, is it's basically a collection of techniques, right? So like where, when, why, and how to burn. And certainly there is a lot to learn from cultural burning about these questions. But if we stop there, I think that we are going to miss some much more important areas that we should be thinking about. And as well as, just going in and learning the techniques and then taking them out of their context is obviously an extractive process. I think that some things that are more interesting for us maybe to think about as non-Native people, we have to go a little bit deeper and think about our whole relationship to fire. In the article that we wrote from this project, we describe an indigenous fire ethic. Again, it's difficult to generalize, but generally there's a different ethic among indigenous people when it comes to fire than what, say, I'm used to in Western culture. And people have a different relationship with fire. One is based on respect. And so fire is considered by some people to be a living thing, pretty much a relative, some people will say, and it deserves respect. One of the fire practitioners we worked with, a collaborator, Diana Almendares, says, when she turns on the TV and sees all these people talking about how bad fire is and destructive and devastating and we need to put it out, she's not surprised after, like, that fire is acting out, fire is being all crazy, right? Because look at how people are talking about it. That's what happens when you talk about people in a bad way like that. They act out. And I think that really talks, about this different relationship that people have with fire. And if we don't respect fire, then we can't expect to have a relationship with it that is going to be one that we're going to like. And then there's this other element of reciprocity, again, that people think about, not just how can we use fire to achieve our goals, right? Like, how can we keep our timber from burning up? How can we make pastures more productive? People think about the whole system, and they think about what can we contribute to the health of the land. So Bill Tripp from the Karuk tribe talks about human services to ecosystems, right? It's not just how is the ecosystem serving us, but how are we helping that ecosystem? And fire is a cornerstone of that reciprocity between people and the land. The other thing that's very different about cultural burning compared to the way that we practice non-natives, the way we practice prescribed fire, is that there's a whole social and cultural context to cultural burning. It's in the name. And prescribed fire, generally speaking, what we have is a professional elite that goes out and executes a plan and has control lines, and they get the job done wearing their uniforms, and at the end of the day, they go home and they never come back. That's maybe a bit of a simplification, but that's generally speaking how prescribed fire, non-native prescribed fire works. In cultural burning, there's a whole system of social connections and interactions and culture that upholds this practice. And so you can't take that practice out of that whole context. There has to be intergenerational knowledge transfer, family-based burning that passes on not just the knowledge of the practice, but values, stories, language, ceremonies. These things are all integral parts of the practice of cultural burning. And if we want to learn from that as non-native people, what does that mean? I think that one of the things it means is that we need to reevaluate our relationship with fire and how fire fits into our society. The only way that most of the time people engage with the public on prescribed fire is to try and educate people to support prescribed fire. Like, we're gonna burn, it's gonna make smoke, we're sorry, but please support us. That's pretty much the extent of engagement a lot of the time around prescribed fire in non-native communities. So very restricted engagement of the public in the issue of the use of fire. So to recap, what does learning mean? To me, it means dialogue, it means learning together, it means having an ethical engagement based on responsibility and recognizing that we need to give back for knowledge that is shared with us, let alone making up for the impacts of colonization and the violent suppression of indigenous fire knowledge, right? And if we want to talk about learning from cultural burning, I think that there are some much deeper lessons than sort of where, when, and how to burn in terms of the way that we relate to fire, the way that we relate to the land, our worldviews around these issues, and the social and cultural context that nurture our connection and relationship to fire. I'll leave you with these words from Danny Manning, a firefighter from the Maidu tribe. You take care of the fire takes care of the land, and the land takes care of you. And I'm happy to take any questions.
So I have a question for both Katie and Chris, especially with your great perspectives on prescribed fire and cultural fire, and Chris, your comments about like learning some of this deeper knowledge. And I'm curious what you see as the path forward that is like embracing and learning some of those deeper concepts without appropriating cultures that aren't ours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm waiting to see if Katie wants to take that one, but I think that that's the trick, and that's why I think that it has to be a dialogue and an exchange and recognition that it's fine to learn from other cultures as long as there's that piece about reciprocity and making sure that we are giving back more than we are receiving, really. I mean, especially when it comes to indigenous cultures, and being colonizers, we have to think about that. And Native people don't have any obligation to share any kind of knowledge whatsoever with us. And so when that happens, it has to be something that is respected and nurtured and thought of in the long-term reconciliation, work that has to happen. I don't know what do you want to add there, Katie?
Great response, great question. I would add that more and more as I formulate ideas and work through them with collaborators, whatever I'm thinking up, whatever I'm hoping to do next, better have an equal or greater benefit for Indigenous people. The learning that I've had the opportunity to be a part of to this point, at first I really did feel like this is incredible. Like, how do I, again, connect that with my personal experience and my ancestors and my awareness of their culture? But how do I, from a position of privilege with a full-time job with the conservation organization that's working specifically to restore the land, and do so using practices that Indigenous people learned, perfected, and continued for years on the land that I'm now a guest. So whatever ideas I'm thinking about taking action on or bringing to life with grant funding and with partners, I'm immediately thinking about how to directly benefit Native people with those actions, and how to, as much as possible, look to their leadership to inform those ideas and actions and work with them to bring them to life. Yeah.
I'll just add, I think that one thing that maybe is important to consider is how can there be direct and immediate benefits to Native people? Because sometimes, it's tricky when you're doing research, you're not going to be publishing probably for years. And, like, what are people really getting out of it? If you go into a community and you're like, hey, we're going to do some research and we're going to publish something, and then it's going to educate people. And then one day, it's going to have a benefit to you. It's like, well, that can be a long shot for people. And so I think that to the degree that you can, even in small ways, just provide immediate benefit for people, I think that's important. you know, for us, you know, we had our students, and it was great. I mean, you know, when you have a good dialogue going, there's always things that come up. So it could be something very simple, like, oh, we wanted to make a plant list at this archaeological site or something. You know, I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily be big. When you have a relationship like that, things come up, and you probably have more to offer than you think, maybe.
Katie, I have a question about your training that you do. What kind of things do you do in that training, and like what topics do you cover, and is it like a two-way training, or I'm kind of curious how like co-managing works in that kind of situation.
Great question. The training we organized last fall, as Chris mentioned, there's this sense that even to be able to engage with fire, you need to go through a rigorous federal government delineated training approach to have the qualifications to be able to even work with fire. So our approach focused on reducing barriers to that coursework and that training. Yesterday in the talk, Sarah Hammond mentioned NWCG, the National Wildfire Coordinating Group, who has the standards for courses for people to be able to have the basic qualifications to burn. So yeah, we worked hard to meet the course objectives so people could have basic firefighter qualifications and be able to participate on prescribed burns. But as much as possible, we made the training hands-on, together on the land, and focused on indigenous fire culture. We added a half day of talking and storytelling about fire culture that was shared amongst participants and the non-native trainers who were offering the basic firefighter coursework. And we focused on controlled burning because this firefighter coursework is really rooted in preparing people for wildland firefighting. And it was a first attempt at completely redoing this basic firefighter coursework so that it is cross-cultural, it is tailored to people of a place, the first people of this place, and still meets those basic firefighter qualifications that agencies still need, that tribes in large part still need to be able to show up and relate with fire on the land. Does that make sense?
I see that. Leslie, you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question that follows up with both of what Chris and Katie have been talking about, making that connection with your tribal partners, and then the challenges that both of you face in both programs, and the way in which you're using the NWCG classes and changing that format and using that as a way to break down a barrier to implementing more prescribed fire and cultural burning. So I wonder, what are other challenges that you both have experienced in your capacity in your organization, both the Long Tom and with the OSU extension? What are some of the challenges you've seen towards implementation of these different restoration projects specifically to fire? And then maybe what are some of the solutions that you've been coming up with, such as creating a class that gets people trained up, but also recognizing the cultural significance of that? What are the barriers and what are some of the solutions?
I can go with one of the barriers, I think, is a lack of understanding by non-native people of what tribal sovereignty means. For example, tribes voluntarily follow state law, but they're actually not obliged to because of their status as sovereign dependent nations. And so some of these fire regulations at the state level, tribes follow those, basically voluntarily, and that can cause some interesting issues when the state then starts to revoke burn permits and stuff like that. Then people have to decide, okay, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to comply with that? Because we don't really have to. I don't know that that's happening a lot in Oregon, but it has come up in California, where tribes do a lot of cultural burns. And then the other thing is that smoke management is similarly regulated at a state level, but the Western Regional Air Partnership recognizes indigenous burning as a natural source of emissions and not an anthropogenic source of emissions, which sounds funny, but basically they're saying that it's natural, so it shouldn't be counted towards air pollution, right? Because it's a natural background source of emissions. However, while that is something that these organizations are signatories of, like our DEQ, I don't think that that is generally implemented. And so a lot of state agencies that regulate air quality end up regulating indigenous burning the same way as non-indigenous burning. So that's another conversation that ends up, happening and being pretty interesting. So I think that going forward, a better understanding of tribal sovereignty would probably open up a lot of doors, I imagine. But that's sort of between tribal advocates and the state government to sort out. That's one thing. Katie?
Great. Yeah, great response. I mentioned capacity and what that means. For us here in the Willamette Valley, when we have the window of opportunity to work with fire, it's fire season, and most of the people locally who are qualified to carry out prescribed burns get called away on wildfire assignments. That equipment gets called away as well. So we're lacking available dedicated people and equipment to carry out prescribed burning when we have the window of opportunity to do so. As Chris mentioned, smoke, because of 200 to 500 years of fire suppression and indigenous burning on the landscape, we are faced with these treatments, thinning, mowing, reducing brush, before we're able to work with fire again on the landscape. Because if we start with fire in a very brushy system, we have a potential to experience smoke for days after that burn, and our local air quality regulators are not okay with that. And most of the general public, it really isn't either, without that better understanding of what's happening. The other challenge is, of course, land access, and the myriad of regulations and permits that go along with burning, whether you're on federal land or private land or tribal land, and being equipped with the insight on even how to navigate those regulations and permits is very, very tricky. So that's why solution oriented, we're really trying to coordinate amongst many different partners and tribal governments to make sense of it all and work towards shared resources in the form of people and equipment that can do work to support prescribed burning in a dedicated way, where we have dedicated people and positions to carry out that work, and those are well developed and well funded in an ongoing way. Yeah, I mentioned the Willamette Valley is 90+% held in private ownership. So while that's a barrier for tribal members in our communities to access the land, for organizations and practitioners like myself who have spent years building relationships with landowners, therein is an opportunity to be able to work together to bring fire back to the land. And on private land, because of the laws that exist currently, private landowners can decide whether they require people to have the NWCG fire qualifications or not. So we are able to work with indigenous fire practitioners on private land who aren't interested in getting that level of qualification, but have an awareness and a learning and a knowledge around fire to be able to access that that place, that space, relate to it with fire, with planting food, and doing so with their family for years to come.
Yeah,
Thank
the
you.
one thing that's not an obstacle generally is public opinion, actually. I think that the public generally understands the nature of this practice as something that goes obviously way back. And generally speaking, prescribed fire people are overwhelmingly in favor of more prescribed fire use. Of course, when they actually see smoke, they might change their mind a little bit. But if you just ask people, like, what do you think about prescribed fire? Most people think very highly of it. So funnily enough, that is not in the top list of problems that we have for once. Changing public opinion is hard, so that's good.
Thank you. All great points.
Yeah, and I'll just say too, in my area in Southwest Oregon, there's sort of an added complication, which is that due to the Rogue River Wars, the tribes were removed from this part of Oregon, and a lot of their descendants now live, Grand Ronde and Siletz, and so it's quite far to travel down here and access opportunities for fire management. So that adds some complication, but like Katie's presentation mentioned, there are a lot of people who are interested in figuring out how we can move forward, and generally a lot of goodwill among land managers. So I think that things are looking generally pretty good. Like there's some good things are happening. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't emphasize enough the importance of consistent, ongoing dialogue, relationship building, sustaining those relationships with our area tribes and tribal members in our communities.
Right, I think we're pretty much at the point to wrap up. I wanted to thank Katie and Chris again. If everybody would just give them a round of applause for sharing their time with us. And I think if you have questions you want to pass along later, you can let us know, and we'll be happy to put you in contact with them.
Thank you all.
Thank you, and thanks for your great work, everybody. And pleasure to see everyone. I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time, both of you.